In the next couple of videos, what we're going to do is we're going to consider the three different arguments that Madison and Davis present as being arguments for the claim that there is a right to the death of the fetus. Now, Madison and Davis are going to try to show that none of these arguments are successful, whereas Ronson, on the other hand, Ronson is going to say, no, these arguments do work, as long as what we do is we understand the right to the death of the fetus as a collective right possessed by both biological parents. So just as a reminder, the three different arguments are the right to prevent parenthood, the right to genetic privacy, and property rights. So in this video, we're going to talk about the right to prevent parenthood. So this argument goes as follows. Becoming a biological parent causes certain harms to the couple because of parental obligations towards the child. Second premise says, the couple has an interest to avoid the harms of parental obligations. Therefore, the couple has a right to the death of the fetus in order to avoid the harms of parental obligations. So let's say a few things about this argument first. One thing to keep in mind is Madison and Davis are understanding this first premise, the one that says becoming a biological parent causes harms to the parent because of parental obligations. They're understanding this premise in terms of what's called attributional parenthood. Take, for example, a woman who decides to be a surrogate mother. Some people would argue that when a woman chooses to be a surrogate mother, she has certain obligations to this child, even though it may not be her child. And that those obligations, even after she delivers the child and it's given to parents, she might be harmed because of these obligations that she has acquired by being a surrogate mother. Likewise, you might think in the case of adoption, you might think that someone who adopts their child out still has certain parental obligations. And it might be the case that certain harms come to the person who adopts their child or who's a surrogate mother. Certain harms might come to this person or this individual because they've relinquished their obligations. In a sense, they've kind of abandoned their child, if you will. Maybe those harms are brought on to this individual by themselves. Maybe that they're self-inflicted harms. Or maybe they're harms that are brought on by the community. Maybe they look down upon this person for some reason. But this is the basic claim with regard to what Madison and Davis are calling attributional parenthood. Now, their point is that those harms are brought about because of these sort of parental obligations that are involved. And insofar as the couple or the woman maybe has an interest to avoid those harms. Of course, we want to interpret interest very carefully here. We don't want to say that they have a right to avoid those harms because that's what's being argued for. But we might say that they have a certain kind of interest. You know, they might have a preference to avoid those harms. And if that can lead to having a right, well, then it might be the case that they do have a right to avoid being a parent or avoid the sort of parental obligations that are involved here. And then, according to this argument, the claim is that, well, the only way to avoid those harms is to have a right to the death of the fetus. That's the kind of the basic structure of the argument. And so let's say a few more things in our evaluation of how this argument's supposed to go. So first of all, we need to consider how Madison and Davis respond to the argument. So they begin by granting that the biological parents can be, at least in some sense, harmed by, say, being discriminated against, right? But they claim that just the mere fact that you can be discriminated against does not automatically guarantee that you have a right to the death of the fetus. You might have a right not to be discriminated against, but it's not obvious that entails that you have a right to the death of the fetus. And then they want to consider some other relevant cases like gamete donation or surrogacy or adoption. They argue, it's kind of an argument by analogy here, we don't seem to think that they have a right to the death of a child in any of these cases, right? Just the mere fact that you might be discriminated against if you're a surrogate mother or if you're adopting your child doesn't mean that you have the right to then go and kill that child. So why would it be any different in the case of a fetus? Now, they grant that seems like it could be maybe an uncharitable way of interpreting this particular argument. And so what they try to show is that at least intuitively, intuitively, we don't think that there's any extra right that the parents have in the case of gamete donation, surrogacy, or adoption. And since intuitively we don't seem to think that there's any extra right in these cases, by analogy with these type of cases, intuitively we don't think that there's some extra right that's possessed by the biological parents either, right? So that seems to suggest that we have very good reasons to doubt that in the case of ectogenesis and abortion, that there's any further right here either. That's kind of an intuitive argument they're making, an intuitive argument by analogy with these other type of cases. Now, Ronson responds to Madison Davis's argument here, right? So Ronson argues that just like in the case of marriage, a case that presumably would be a kind of collective right, there's also a collective right in the case of the death of the fetus. It's a right that both biological parents have. And so if it's the case that they are going to kill the fetus, then it's got to be the case that both of them agree to do this because it's a collective right. So presumably, according to Ronson at least, what that means is in the case of these kind of parental obligations that are involved, it's going to be something that's involved for both of the parents. That seems to be the way that Ronson's responding here. Interestingly, for Ronson, attributional parenthood is playing a really important role here. Ronson thinks that attributional parenthood, these sort of parental obligations, should be understood in terms of either a causal theory of parental obligation or a kind of genetic theory of parental obligation. And this might be a little different than the way we normally think about parental obligations. You might think that parental obligations are brought about by sort of relations that the parent has with the child. So in the case of adoption, you might think that the biological mother can relinquish her parental obligations, and then the adopted parents now take on their obligations towards the child. And that would be seen as a kind of relational way of thinking about parental obligations in a case like this. But according to Ronson, he thinks that there's good reasons to be skeptical of that view of parental obligations. Instead, maybe we should be thinking about parental obligations in terms of either having the right kind of genetic ties to the child or being a part of the sort of the causal process that brings the child into the world. So clearly in the case of gamete donation, that would involve these sort of genetic ties. In the case of surrogacy, that would be playing a role in the sort of causal mechanisms that are involved in bringing the child into the world. And so this is important for Ronson because Ronson's going to argue that if we think about parental obligations in one of these sort of ways, then parental obligations are non-transferable. They're not the sort of thing that you can simply relinquish. And importantly, Ronson thinks that that's the case for both biological parents, not just the woman. And so as such, what Ronson does is appeals to several different authors who seem to disagree with the intuition that Madison and Davis have presented, right? Madison and Davis seem to be working off of this intuition that the parental obligations are the sort of thing that can be relinquished. But if they're not, if parental obligations are based upon this sort of causal theory of obligations or genetic theory of obligations such that there is no transferring of the parental obligations, well then in the case of surrogacy and adoption and gamete donations and so forth, you might think that these sort of cases are actually immoral, right? Those are the kind of intuitions that the authors Ronson appeals to are working off of, right? Now, since parental obligations, according to Ronson and these other authors, since they're non-transferable, then the only way to avoid the harms of attributional parenthood really is that the parents must have a right to the death of the fetus. And that's specifically if those parental obligations are non-transferable. So now let's try to think about some ways in which we could criticize what Ronson has said here. All right, so we might wonder whether it's really true that that parental obligations are non-transferable in this way, right? So that would be a way of objecting to either the causal theory of obligation, parental obligation, or the genetic theory of parental obligation. Another way to think about this is when a person gives their child up for adoption, are they really doing something immoral? Well, on kind of a genetic theory of parental obligations, you might think they are doing something immoral. So which intuitions do we favor in a case like this? Do we favor the intuitions that say, no, 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 those parental obligations definitely are transferable? Now, of course, that is just appealing to intuitions. And we might think that we need to do more than just appeal to our intuitions. In fact, this is a point that Ronson makes. He thinks that, yeah, intuitions can go one way or the other, and we need to do something more than appeal to intuitions. We need to actually provide, according to Ronson, we would need to provide an actual theory of parental obligations that would allow for Madison and Davis' objections to go through. And so we might ask, is it really the case that the intuitions involved in an argument by analogy, the kind of argument that Madison and Davison is working with, are those intuitions really insufficient to provide good reasons to reject the presumed right to prevent parenthood? One might think that, no, Rossman's right. You need to do more than just appeal to these intuitions. But you might also think that Madison and Davison is onto something here. These intuitions do seem pretty strong. That's an open question that we'll have to consider. And we might also ask, is it really true that if there's a right to the death of the fetus, then it's a collective right possessed by the biological parents? And so this is a really important part for Rosnan's response to what Matheson and Davis say. And we might think that Rosnan owes us a positive argument for thinking that it is a collective right. Normally, we think that if a woman has a right to abortion, that this is something that she has as an individual right. We don't, generally speaking, think of abortion as being a right that's possessed by both biological parents. Granted, we might think that the woman and the biological father should be able to discuss and talk about what their options are. We might even think that's the ideal. But at the end of the day, most people seem to think that it's a right possessed by the woman alone. So if Roslin's right, then it looks like if there's a right to the death of the fetus, then it's not the case that it's the right the woman has alone. As such, we might think that Roslin owes us a positive argument for thinking that this is a collective right. Otherwise, he does seem to be appealing to intuitions with regarding like maybe marriage as a collective right. Is that enough? Or does Ronson also need to do more than simply appeal to intuitions? So the next argument that we're going to consider is the right to genetic privacy. And so we'll talk about that argument in the next lecture.